Cool. That was an awesome session, Cheyenne, and probably a good lead-in because Cheyenne teed up several things that a lot of you are thinking about with respect to metrics and everything else about how to measure what your team does and the value added. So let's take it away. And I work at LinkedIn. I've been there for just over a year and was at Gainsight prior to that for several years. Awesome. Before we talk about metrics, I truly believe in this, which is you can actually only improve what you measure, and so super important that we talk about this at this point in time. All right. And why now? I was just thinking about this, and this was a post by a CEO on LinkedIn that basically said we've gone through a few different industry trends more recently. There was the first the Great Recession, then there was like the Great Reshuffle, which was a lot of talent leaving and moving jobs and finding jobs that combine hybrid and at work type setups. And we think we are in the great rationalization phase right now, where over the last couple of years, several companies have bought a lot of software tools, and now CEOs, CFOs, CIOs are taking a stance and saying, do we really need all of these spends that we have? And what is the value of one versus the other? And am I getting outcomes from one vendor versus the other? So if there was ever time for you to think about measuring and thinking about the value provided to your customers, value of your teams, now is the time because your customers are asking these tough questions. Before you talk about metrics, the first thing I'll say is it's important, before you think about like what the metrics for a CSM organization should be, first thing to answer for yourself is why does the CSM team even exist? And I'm not being facetious, that isn't an easy response. A lot of companies just tumble into the CSM profession, get it up and running and run with it. I think it is worth taking a step back and saying like, why do we exist and what is the key reason we exist and what are we trying to solve for? Cheyenne had a few prompts on what the CSM team can contribute to. But Gainsight did this survey a few months back, and net retention rate seems to be amongst the top contenders. Product adoption, product utilization were certain other metrics that came up. Some companies think of CSMs as, like especially companies with very sticky products where you're not worried about net retention rate and other metrics. The primary thing is how do we get more advocates and more promoters out of the equation, right? So you have to ask the tough question of why do we exist and what is that key objective metric that we're trying to influence. The other thing that I will call out as you think about what to measure is there are two facets to delivering customer success. The first one is and I'll go the other way, which is what outcomes is your product and your service delivering to your customers? And then the second question is what experience does your customer have working with your company and your products and services? That is super critical. Think of like a simple example would be in the world where we used to travel a lot. You used to take an Uber or a Lyft in the morning to get to the airport. Getting from point A to point B is the outcome that you want from the ride. But if the driver is talking to you at 5 a.m. in the morning on your way to the airport or playing music you don't like, that is the experience out of that equation. You can translate that exact same thing to your business to business world as well. And it's equally important to deliver on both of these for long-standing relationships with your customers. And so as you think about metrics, keep both of these pieces in mind and not just one. And so as you think about CSM metrics, I've often thought about it as a phased approach. You can't go from starting a CSM team to suddenly measuring them on net retention rate or product adoption. Your team doesn't know what to do on a day-to-day basis, right? Like, so if you're early in your maturity of a CSM team, these are unsexy metrics, but they're very critical metrics, right? Is your team picking up the phone and having a conversation or getting on a Zoom call and doing a business review. If you want them to do trainings for your customers, how many trainings are they doing on a monthly basis, weekly basis, etc. Again, think of it as what an SDR, or like a sales development representative or a business development representative would do. It is those types of metrics that you start doing. This is not where you want to end at, but this is a good starting point. Ideally, you can move to phase 2 very quickly and talk about what the leading indicators to the objective function are. These typically would translate to product adoption. It would translate to health score changes, similar to what Cheyenne was talking about. Any net promoter score type metrics that are influenced by what the CSM does, but there are so many other inputs that go into an NPS score. But think of those as leading indicators to know, because I did phase 1 activities, are things actually improving for my customer or not? Like, if this trend continues, then I will end up in a good place with customer value, and hence they'll grow with us and renew and all of that good stuff. So that is phase 2, and this typically for most CS organizations, this is a natural resting state. This is where they spend a lot of their energy on. Soon your CFO is going to wake up and say, are you a cost center or a profit center? Like, what should you stand for, etc. So phase 3 are now, because you did those activities, your leading indicators like product utilization is changing and improving, health score is improving, net promoter scores are improving. That should ideally lead to some form of value / financial metric. That is where you should ideally end at, and you can stake a claim and say, because the CSM team exists, my ROI or outcomes delivered to our customers went up by X%, which then resulted in gross retention rate going up or renewal rate going up or expansion going up or growth going up. That is the end state that you want to end up at. Typically what I've seen, again, you have to test what this means for your businesses, but typically I would say spend like 6 months or so in phase 1, spend a fair amount of time in phase 2 getting to a really good stable situation, and then typically takes anywhere from 6 to 12 months to get to that point, maybe even 18 months to get to that point, and then think about the lagging outcomes. You can start measuring phase 3 type approaches while you are in phase 2, but that you still don't know if you can predictably and consistently deliver on phase 3 type objectives. So take that phased approach. Don't jump when you create a new team. Don't jump directly to phase 3, because you can't control for the input variables that lead to that outcome. In addition, it is like any good business owner will think about the input-output metrics, but will also think about cost metrics. And so when it comes to cost metrics, oftentimes CSM teams think about the cost of retaining a customer, or CRC type metrics, which roughly translates to CSM all-in cost, which includes benefits and any operations teams that you might have, etc., divided by the revenue managed by that piece of business, by the total CSM cost. Oftentimes, people will also look at the flip of that, which is like revenue managed per CSM or number of customers managed per CSM. Those are also good metrics, but I prefer the CRC metric because there are some benchmarks associated with it that you can start thinking about and plot where you are versus where you want to be. So if you need one slide to think about like what to anchor on, this is it. Like, this is how I would think about the business and what to measure in each of your businesses. A few things, like this was again like interesting data points from a recent survey of chief customer officers. Phase 2, which is like where you're thinking about the leading indicators, most companies or 50% of companies thought of product utilization metrics. So MAU, DAU, monthly active users, daily active users type metrics as like the ideal phase 2 metric. There's obviously also thinking about other utilization metrics, CSAT scores, etc. But these are a few examples. If you want to land in phase 2, these are a few examples of what your peers in other companies are thinking about. As you go into phase 3, a lot of companies are thinking about net revenue retention as that metric, financial metric to anchor on, or churn, which is like 1 minus gross retention rate, as another metric to think about. through that process. Customer logo churn also comes up in a few places where if your average contract value per customer is fairly standard, you cater to one segment and it's pretty standard across the spectrum, that might be a good proxy for you to look at as well. But if, like most companies, if you've got like a different segment for enterprise and a different segment for SMB, that type of logo churn doesn't give you the whole picture. But there are still companies that measure that for sure. And then I'm almost done, but the final one that I'll call out is when you think about cost metrics, which is the cost of retaining a customer. Most companies, or the median, is about 6% CSM cost to revenue ratio. So good exercise for you all to go back, either for your team or segment that you manage, or for all CSMs within your purview. Think about what that cost looks like and how that compares to maybe the 3%, which is the 25th percentile, or the 10%, which seems to be the 75th percentile. Where in that spectrum are you? This obviously depends on a lot of things, like your product stickiness, how mature is the industry that you're selling into. All of that play into this equation. But this roughly gives you a spectrum to think about. And then the right-hand side has the same metrics but split by average contract value. So depending on how much your products sell for to your customers, you can also take a lens to see where my benchmark should be. Cool. I'll close this out with a few summary remarks. So first, before you think about metrics, think about what the purpose of your organization is. Like, is it to improve product utilization? Is it to improve customer satisfaction? Is it to drive opportunities for growth as part of sales plays? Define the purpose, that one objective function. There are many things that you will work on, but what is that one objective function that you want to solve for? Second, think of both outcomes and experience metrics, not just one. And then the third one is go through that phased approach, depending on the maturity of your CS organization, of activities to leading indicators to lagging outcomes. And then just like any good business owner, think about these input-output metrics, but also the cost metrics, because sooner or later your CFO is going to ask you for those metrics, and it's just good business practice to manage those. And then make steady progress. Go win.
Excellent. That's a great purview into how data and metrics come together. I want to kick off with a question for you. Say monthly usage or daily usage, and if I'm a CSM and I'm seeing a tick downwards, what is that leading indicator telling me? What is that weather pattern? Like, what am I looking at if that's trending downwards?
Yeah, it is. Again, like, it is a good leading indicator. The most important thing is, after that, the work to be done is to go back and say, why is it happening? Right? There could be a bunch of reasons. In some businesses, there is some seasonality to the business, right? Like schools opening or retail has certain seasonality. Is this to be expected, or is this truly an indication of lack of engagement, and hence we have to do something about it? Digging into that data would be the first step that I would recommend. After which you can then say, like, if it is truly a seasonality and we should just account for this as regular business, then no action required. But if this is not a seasonality and it is truly an aberration, then the next step would be creating playbooks for the CSMs to say, when this happens, I want you to try these 4 or 5 different plays. Some of them may work in your customer context, some of them may not, but you'll soon learn by experimenting with those 4 or 5 plays to see what works and what doesn't work. And then correlate it back to, like, let's take 2 or 3 months or however long it takes to execute on those playbooks. Go back and see which of those plays actually resulted in the MAUs increasing again. Bonus points, sometimes these plays are gamification tools that give you a quick spike back in MAUs but are not sustainable MAUs. Keep that long-term lens in mind and say, like, for those customers, that like cohort of customers that dropped in MAU, went back up again, did they actually sustain over a 12-month period? That is, like, again, bonus in your maturity as you go through your CS plays.
Very nice. Question over here.
Thank you. Great presentation. Really appreciate it. With the phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3 metrics, do you ever find yourself revisiting them to say, hey, our hypothesis on what would move the needle here? You had business reviews, right, in phase 1?
Yep.
And then laddering all the way up to phase 3. How often do you recommend revisiting those to say, hey, maybe the metric is good, but our execution of it is not getting us the growth that we expected in that higher level metric?
Awesome. Excellent question. Yes, 100% recommend that you go back and look at it. Typically, I'd say it's a good idea as part of your annual planning process where you're thinking about like how much more headcount to add, what tools to invest in, and all of that good stuff. That is a good time to take a pause and see if everything that you thought was true last year is still true in the year that you're planning for. These things don't change all that much year over year, so maybe like a 2-year period is when things would drastically change. Things that can affect this in a meaningful way would be like completely new product introduction that is transforming the market, or the role of what is expected, the purpose of the CSM team changes 1 year to the next. All of those will cause you to go back and say like, we should revisit this. Otherwise, it's a good idea to look at it, but I don't think it changes all that much.
Hi, thank you so much for this presentation. Really interesting. I'm curious for business models that aren't subscription-based, how you think about maybe adjusting some of those metrics. I work for Stripe, for example, and it's more about the user and the customer and how much they're driving and the margin that we derive from that. And so some of these metrics don't work in the same way. So I'm wondering how you think about maybe adjusting or things you've seen that have worked in that kind of space.
Excellent question. I think the phased approach could still work, but the metrics that you use will obviously change. I think with products like Stripe and others where it is consumption driven and not, so basically if customers use your product, you get direct feedback then and there because they'll spend more with you, right? So the loop between, there isn't a sales cycle to sell more. It is if you use my product more, you spend more with me. In that model, I think data obviously is super critical, plus the lens of some of these usage metrics become even, like phase 2 usage metrics become even more critical, where you're looking at those trends and seeing if those are improving year over year or quarter over quarter. Seasonality comes into play in a meaningful way in some of those areas. I've often seen consumption companies also think about the CX metric a lot more than the outcome metrics, because the data science models, et cetera, are so plugged in for the outcome side of things, but they're not so plugged in for the experience part of things. So think about number of open support tickets as an example. If customers will not increase their share of wallet with Stripe or with any other consumption business, if they have tons of open support ticket with one vendor versus the other. So that might be an interesting, the CX piece of the equation is where you lean into as a consumption-driven business.
Good morning. So you and the past couple of speakers really emphasized NPS as a metric, and I'm wondering if you have any best practices around that. Like, are you really just asking the basic question, how likely are you or your colleague to recommend to you or a colleague, or are you digging in more? And also just kind of curious how you prevent bleed over, right? Like, how do you focus the NPS survey on what you're trying to survey?
Excellent question. And like NPS is a one that gets like very polarizing points of view. It's like the GIF versus GIF debate. I think you get a lot of different points of view when you ask about NPS. NPS is like one, this is purely my point of view, and I'm not an NPS expert by any means. So you should take it with that grain of salt or that caveat. I think NPS is a composite metric. Lots of things go into why someone decides to to recommend your product or not. And the product itself plays a huge role in delivering versus that. In addition, how a customer experiences the account team and the support team and a bunch of other services associated with it all go into that mix. So and there is lots of research that suggests that NPS in B2B businesses is not correlated to churn all that much, but is heavily correlated to growth and expansion. So people will continue, if they get outcomes, they will continue to spend the same amount of money that they did last year, but won't commit to additional funds with you, right? So thinking about all of these pieces as part of that Net Promoter Score is how I would approach it. I think the one best practice that has definitely worked for me across companies is following up when people respond to your survey. People typically respond to Net Promoter Score surveys when either they've had an awesome experience and they want to tell you, or they've had a terrible experience and they want to tell you. In either of these situations, closing the loop back with the customer to say, we did something really well and you're a promoter, how can I understand that on a deep level and replicate that to the rest of my business? Or vice versa, which is like something bad happened, how can I learn from it so that we don't try to repeat that, or we try not to repeat that going forward? That I think is regardless of what you're trying to achieve, that is a best practice that I would highly recommend.
Hi, thank you so much for the presentation. I had a question about the CS spend. In your presentation, you mentioned that companies usually spend 3 to 20% of their revenue in CS teams. For early stage companies, if you're on a tight budget, what would be the best approach to staff the CS team?
Yeah, I wish I could tell you there is one answer. I think, again, it depends on what the CS team is trying to solve at an early stage company. I've seen early stage companies where CSMs are kind of like the extensions of product managers. The primary job is we don't have product market fit yet. And we are trying to get CSMs to be that voice of the customer to tell us this use case works exceptionally well, this use case, our product doesn't deliver value, right? In that model, you are going out of your way to invest in product management capabilities, and hence your CSM to the cost to retain customers will be higher. Once you do get product market fit and you're starting to scale the business, you can start looking at different purposes for the CS team. Very difficult also in the early stages to get scale out of the equation, right? Like there are certain things you'll have to onboard the early CSMs. Your first few CSMs tend to be unicorn CSMs. You expect them to do everything and some more, right? And so you will hire much higher quality candidates, and it's really hard to scale those businesses. So my sense or my experience is at early stage companies, CSM cost to ARR ratio tends to be towards the higher side of that equation.
More questions? Anyone out there? Okay, so we are going to wrap up this. Thank you very much, Ashwin.
My pleasure.
Great.